Chicago. 2:13 a.m. like snow hammered against the hospital windows like handfuls of ice being thrown at the building. The emergency room downstairs had been overflowing for hours. Homeless men, war veterans, single mothers holding feverish children wrapped in cheap store blankets. And somewhere inside Hartwell Memorial Hospital, a little girl was slowly running out of breath. Naomi Brooks pushed her cleaning cart slowly through the VIP corridor on the 14th floor. The old wheels squeaked against the polished marble floor, bleach, rubbing alcohol, cold coffee. This hallway always smelled like rich people trying to hide death behind money. Naomi pulled her worn janitor gloves tighter around her hands. The skin on her fingers was cracked from chemicals and brutal Chicago winters. Tonight was supposed to be a normal shift. Finish cleaning the VIP floor, clock out at 4 a.m., catch the last bus back to South Side. Sleep a few hours before returning to the hospital again. Poor people don't really sleep. They just pause their exhaustion for a little while. As Naomi walked past the executive conference room, she suddenly froze. A voice echoed from inside that she knew too well. Adrian Cole, her husband, CEO of the entire Hartwell Memorial System. Naomi slowly stopped her cleaning cart beside the half-open door. Inside the room, men in expensive suits stood around a glowing glass conference table. Emergency snowstorm warnings flashed silently across the television mounted on the wall. One doctor spoke first, his voice tense with worry. "Sir, Ward C is already full." Adrian didn't even look up from the paperwork in his hand, then shut it down. The entire room fell silent. Naomi blinked slowly. She thought she heard him wrong. The doctor swallowed hard. "But those patients need surgery." This time Adrian finally looked up. His eyes were so cold they made the room feel smaller. "The investors arrive tomorrow morning." He pointed toward the lower floors of the hospital. "I don't want uninsured, poor patients flooding the hallways while the media is here filming." Naomi felt her chest tighten instantly. A young nurse standing near the back of the room suddenly started crying. A little girl could die. Adrian stayed silent for a few seconds. Then he answered coldly, "Then transfer her somewhere else." Outside the windows, snow continued falling across the entire city of Chicago. But inside Naomi, something had just died completely. If you've ever been betrayed by the person you trusted most, take a second to subscribe right now. Because this story isn't only about money or power. It's about the moment a person realizes love can become colder than a Chicago winter. Naomi stood frozen outside the conference room door. The man who had just decided the fate of poor patients was the same man who once slept beside her in a tiny apartment for years. The same man who once promised he would never forget where he came from. But money didn't change Adrian Cole. It simply gave the monster inside him enough power to finally show its face. Naomi Brooks met Adrian Cole long before the tailored suits, private investors, and luxury penthouses. Back then, Chicago did not know his name. He was just another exhausted black kid from South Side, trying to survive a city that buried poor people faster than it saved them. Their first apartment sat above a broken liquor store beside a train track that shook the walls every night. The ceiling leaked when it rained. Roaches crawled through the kitchen cabinets. In winter, the heater barely worked, so they sometimes slept wearing coats under 3 layers of blankets. But every night, Adrian still studied medicine textbooks at the tiny folding table beside the window. Naomi would sit nearby eating instant noodles straight from the pot because they could not afford bowls big enough for both of them. Those were hard years, the kind of years that leave permanent scars on people. But Naomi loved him with the kind of loyalty money cannot buy anymore. Adrian used to come home exhausted from medical school with dark circles under his eyes and hospital blood still on his shoes. Naomi would already be awake waiting for him even after finishing double shifts herself. Morning shift at a nursing home. Night shift cleaning office building down. Sometimes she worked 19 hours straight, not because she wanted to, because survival was expensive. Poor couples don't dream together first. They struggle together first. One freezing night, Adrian sat at the kitchen table staring silently at a letter from the medical board. Naomi noticed immediately what happened. Adrian rubbed his face hard. The licensing exam fee went up again. Naomi stayed quiet. "How much?" He laughed bitterly. "More than we have." The room fell silent except for the sound of the train passing outside. Adrian looked ashamed even speaking about it. "Maybe I should take another year off." Naomi looked at him sharply. "No, Naomi, no." Adrian leaned back heavily. We can't afford this anymore. Naomi glanced toward the window. Her old silver Toyota sat parked beside the sidewalk downstairs covered in snow. That car was the only valuable thing she owned. It got her to work every morning, got her home safely at night, helped them buy groceries, helped them survive winters. The next morning, Adrian woke up and noticed the parking space outside was empty. "Where's your car?" Naomi calmly placed an envelope on the table beside him. Inside was enough money to pay the entire medical exam fee. Adrian stared at her in shock. "Naomi," she kept pouring coffee quietly. "You sold it?" Naomi nodded once. Adrian stood up immediately. "Why would you do that?" For the first time, her voice cracked slightly. "Because one of us has to make it out." Adrian looked at the envelope for a very long time without speaking. Naomi smiled weakly. "I can take the bus." Adrian pulled her into his arms so tightly she could barely breathe. Back then, he still cried when someone sacrificed for him. That's how she knew the man she married later was no longer the same person. If this story touches your heart so far, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us until the end. Because sometimes the people who sacrifice the most are the ones who get hurt the deepest. Years passed slowly. Adrian eventually passed his exams, then residency, then private healthcare consulting. Money finally started entering their lives little by little. Naomi still remembers the first expensive suit Adrian ever bought. He stood in front of the mirror smiling like a little boy who finally escaped poverty. She smiled with him that night, because she truly believed their suffering had meant something. But success changes some people quietly, like rust spreading underneath metal. At first, Adrian only stopped mentioning South Side. Then he stopped visiting old friends. Then he started correcting Naomi's grammar at dinner parties. Eventually, he stopped introducing her as his wife at elite hospital events altogether. "This is Naomi," he would say casually. Just Naomi, never his wife. Never the woman who sold her last car so he could become the man standing in that expensive suit. Some people don't betray you all at once. They betray you slowly, one small humiliation at a time. Success came into Adrian Cole's life quietly at first. A better office, a bigger paycheck, invitations to private medical conferences downtown. Then suddenly everything changed at once. Expensive watches replaced the old cracked phone he once carried through medical school. Tailored suits replaced the discount store jackets Naomi used to buy for him every Christmas. Luxury investors started calling him the future of healthcare. And eventually, Hartwell Memorial announced Adrian Cole as the youngest CEO in the hospital network's history. The news spread across Chicago fast. Black excellence, self-made success. The kid from South Side who made it to the top floor. Cameras flashed in his face during interviews, while journalists praised his intelligence and leadership. Naomi watched every interview proudly from the small break room television during her night shifts. Every single one. She still remembered the nights he fell asleep hungry beside her. Still remembered rubbing his shoulders while he studied until sunrise. Watching him succeed felt like watching her own prayers finally come true. That was the cruel part. The people who hurt you the deepest are usually the same people you once thanked God for. At first, Adrian promised nothing between them would change. "We made it together," he told her one night while unpacking boxes inside their new penthouse overlooking downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble countertops, wine cooler, private elevator. Naomi walked through the apartment slowly in disbelief. She had spent most of her life cleaning places like this for other people. Now, she lived in one. Adrian kissed her forehead softly. "No more struggling." Naomi smiled against his chest. "No more buses in winter." Adrian laughed quietly. "Never again." But money changes the way certain people see the world, especially people who spent their entire childhood feeling small. A few months later, Adrian began hosting investor dinners and charity galas for Hartwell Memorial. Naomi tried her best to fit into those rooms full of wealthy donors and politicians. She bought elegant dresses on sale, watched YouTube videos teaching fine dining etiquette, practiced speaking more professionally before events because Adrian once told her she sounded too South Side around investors. That sentence stayed in her chest for weeks. Shame cuts deeper when it comes from someone who knows exactly where you came from. One evening, Hartwell Memorial hosted a luxury fundraising gala inside the Grand Palmer Hotel downtown. Crystal chandeliers glowed above hundreds of wealthy guests dressed in black tuxedos and diamonds. A live jazz band played near the ballroom stage while photographers moved through the crowd, capturing Chicago's elite smiling beside oversized donation checks. Naomi stood in front of the mirror inside the hotel bathroom, adjusting the sleeves of her dark dress nervously. She looked beautiful, simple, but she still felt out of place inside rooms like these. When she finally walked back into the ballroom searching for Adrian, she spotted him near the investor tables, laughing with several executives. For a moment, Naomi smiled watching him. He looked confident, powerful, untouchable. Then one of the investors noticed her approaching. "Adrian," the older man said casually. "And who's this?" Naomi waited. Adrian glanced at her briefly, just one tiny second that changed everything. Then he smiled politely toward the investors. "This is Naomi," that was it. "Just Naomi, not my wife. Not the woman who carried me through poverty. Not the woman who sold her last car so I could become the man standing in this ballroom. Just Naomi." The investor shook her hand politely before turning back toward Adrian almost immediately. Naomi stood there silently while the conversation continued around her like she wasn't even part of it anymore. Adrian never noticed the way her smile disappeared, or maybe he noticed and simply didn't care. Sometimes disrespect arrives so quietly nobody else in the room even sees it happen. Later that night, Naomi stood alone near the dessert table sipping water while two wealthy women nearby whispered to each other. "She works at the hospital, right?" one woman murmured softly. "I think housekeeping." The other woman laughed lightly. "Really? I thought she was staff too." Naomi lowered her eyes toward the glass in her hand. Across the ballroom, Adrian heard them. Naomi knew he heard them because their eyes met for a brief second. He could have walked over, could have corrected them, could have said proudly, "That's my wife." But he didn't move. Adrian simply turned back toward the investors and continued smiling through another conversation about hospital expansion contracts. And in that exact moment, Naomi finally understood something painful. Adrian Cole no longer hated poverty because he suffered through it. He hated poverty because it reminded him of who he used to be. If this story is pulling you in so far, take a moment to subscribe and stay until the end. Because the deepest betrayals rarely begin with cheating. They begin the moment someone starts feeling embarrassed by the person who loved them before success arrived. That night, Naomi rode home in silence beside Adrian's black luxury sedan while snow drifted slowly across the Chicago streets outside. Adrian scrolled through emails on his phone without looking at her once. Naomi stared quietly through the window at people waiting for buses in the freezing cold. People who still looked like them. People Adrian no longer wanted to resemble. And somewhere, deep inside her chest, a quiet distance had already begun growing between them. The snowstorm hit Chicago harder after midnight. Wind screamed between the hospital towers like something angry moving through the city. Ambulance sirens echoed endlessly outside Hartwell Memorial while emergency lights painted the snow red and blue across the streets below. Inside the hospital, exhaustion hung in the air thicker than the smell of bleach and medicine. Nurses moved quickly between overcrowded hallways. Doctors barked orders across trauma rooms. Somewhere downstairs, a man was screaming in pain. Somewhere else, a baby had been crying for nearly 20 minutes straight. Hospitals sound different during storms. They stop feeling like buildings. They start sounding like battlefields. Naomi Brooks pushed her cleaning cart slowly toward the executive floor just after 2 a.m. Her lower back ached from 12 straight hours of work. She had barely eaten all day except for vending machine crackers and burnt coffee from the staff lounge. But overtime shifts meant extra money, and extra money meant survival. Especially lately. Adrian barely came home anymore unless cameras or donors were around. Most nights, Naomi slept alone inside a penthouse that felt colder than the apartment they once shared in poverty. Funny how bigger homes sometimes make loneliness louder. As Naomi reached the VIP conference corridor, she noticed something unusual immediately. Security guards stood outside the executive meeting room. Several luxury SUVs were still parked outside below despite the storm. Important people, investor people. Naomi lowered her eyes and quietly pushed her cart forward. Invisible workers survive by pretending not to notice powerful people. One guard glanced at her briefly before looking away again. To men like him, Naomi was just another janitor in a gray uniform pushing bleach across expensive floors. Nobody important ever notices the people cleaning around them. That's why they accidentally reveal their ugliest secrets in front of them. Naomi turned toward the supply closet near the conference room when she suddenly heard Adrian's voice through the partially open door. Sharp, cold. She froze immediately. Ward C is costing us too much money. Naomi slowly stepped closer without realizing it. Inside the room, nearly 10 executives sat around a massive glowing conference table, covered with hospital reports and financial projections. Snowstorm footage flashed silently across multiple TV screens mounted on the walls. A nervous doctor leaned forward first. "Sir, with the storm getting worse, transferring patients tonight would be extremely dangerous." Adrian stood near the head of the table adjusting the cufflinks on his shirt calmly. "Dangerous doesn't mean impossible." Another executive cleared his throat awkwardly. "But many of those patients don't have transportation options." Adrian finally looked up. His face showed absolutely nothing. No guilt. No hesitation. "Then discharge the stable ones and redirect the rest." Naomi felt her stomach tighten instantly. Redirect them where? Every hospital in Chicago was already overwhelmed because of the storm. Everyone inside that room knew it. One older surgeon spoke carefully. "Adrian, some of these people need immediate surgery." Adrian walked slowly toward the giant glass windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Snow buried the streets below in white darkness. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly, "the Reynolds Investment Group tours this hospital." He turned back toward the room. "I will not have uninsured poor patients lining the hallways when they arrive." Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that makes decent people ashamed to breathe. Naomi's fingers slowly tightened around the handle of her cleaning cart. She almost couldn't recognize the man speaking inside that room. This was not the exhausted medical student who once cried in her arms because he couldn't afford textbooks. This was someone else entirely. Money doesn't always corrupt people immediately. Sometimes it slowly removes every human part they were hiding underneath. Then a young nurse, standing near the far side of the room, suddenly spoke up. Her eyes were already wet with tears. "There's a little girl in Ward C waiting for emergency surgery." Adrian didn't answer. The nurse swallowed hard before continuing. "If we transfer her now." Her voice cracked. Naomi stopped breathing. Adrian remained silent for a few seconds. Then he calmly picked up another financial report from the table. "Then transfer her somewhere else." The room froze. One executive looked physically uncomfortable. Another lowered his eyes toward the table. But nobody challenged Adrian again. That was the moment Naomi felt something break permanently inside her chest. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like ice cracking beneath someone standing too long in the cold. Outside the conference room door, Naomi's cleaning cart remained beside her, and buried underneath extra paper towels and chemical bottles sat a small black recording device the janitorial department used to document maintenance issues during overnight shifts. Earlier that night, Naomi had switched it on while reporting broken plumbing in another hallway. She had completely forgotten it was still recording. A tiny red light blinked softly beneath the cart shelves, capturing every word, every order, every threat, every sentence that could destroy Adrian Cole's entire career. Naomi slowly looked down toward the cart, then back toward the conference room. Her heartbeat pounded so hard, she thought someone inside might hear it through the walls. She suddenly realized something terrifying. God had just placed the truth directly into her hands. And truth becomes dangerous the moment someone powerful realizes you possess it. If you're still watching right now, subscribe and stay with this story until the end. Because tonight wasn't the night Naomi lost her marriage. It was the night she discovered the man she loved had already sold his soul long ago. Inside the conference room, Adrian continued discussing investors, optics, and financial exposure while snow buried Chicago outside. But Naomi no longer heard the rest clearly. All she could hear was one sentence repeating over and over inside her head. A little girl could die, and the worst part was, Adrian Cole had sounded completely comfortable with that. Naomi did not sleep after that night. She lay awake beside Adrian while snow continued falling outside the penthouse windows, listening to the slow rhythm of his breathing in the dark. The same man who once held her hands and promised they would escape poverty together had just decided poor patients were bad for business. Adrian slept peacefully on Egyptian cotton sheets, worth more than Naomi's first apartment rent. That part hurt more than she expected. Evil becomes far more terrifying when it sleeps comfortably. Around 4:30 in the morning, Adrian's phone vibrated softly on the nightstand. He reached for it half awake before quietly leaving the bedroom balcony to answer the call. Naomi remained still beneath the blankets. Years of struggle had taught her how to stay invisible when necessary. Through the partially opened balcony door, she heard fragments of his conversation carried by the winter wind. "No, move the transfers before media arrives." Silence. "I don't care if County General is full." Another pause. Adrian's voice became colder. Somehow, Naomi slowly closed her eyes. Somewhere in Chicago, sick people were being treated like furniture that needed rearranging before rich investors showed up. Healthcare was supposed to save lives, not protect stock prices. The next morning, Adrian left early for another investor meeting downtown. Naomi watched his black luxury SUV disappear beneath the snow-covered streets below. Then she did something she had never done in 8 years of marriage. She opened his home office. The room smelled like leather, expensive cologne, and fresh printer ink. Floor-to-ceiling shelves displayed medical awards, framed business magazine covers, and photographs of Adrian shaking hands with politicians and investors. Success looked beautiful hanging on walls. It looked much uglier behind closed doors. Naomi sat carefully in Adrian's office chair. Her hands trembled slightly. Part of her still hoped she was overreacting. Maybe the meeting last night had sounded worse than it truly was. Maybe there was another explanation. Maybe the man she loved still existed somewhere underneath all this money and power. Then she opened the first locked drawer. Inside were patient transfer reports from Ward C. Naomi frowned immediately. Several patients marked stable for transfer had severe emergency notes attached to their files. Heart complications, internal bleeding, respiratory failure. One file belonged to a 7-year-old girl named Kiara Matthews. Status awaiting emergency surgery. Recommended transfer during blizzard conditions. Naomi stared at the page for several long seconds. Her chest tightened painfully. This wasn't negligence anymore. This was calculated. Rich people often call cruelty policy when they need it to sound professional. Naomi opened another folder, then another. Soon papers covered the entire desk around her. Insurance denials, delayed surgeries, internal financial reports discussing low-value patients. But one document made her blood run cold completely. Project Clean Hallway. Naomi read the title twice. Hidden beneath polished corporate language was a quiet strategy designed to move uninsured patients out of public areas before investor visits and media events. Patients were literally being relocated to protect the hospital's image. Naomi leaned back slowly in Adrian's chair, feeling sick. The hospital wasn't overwhelmed accidentally. This was intentional. Then she noticed something else. Several digital files remained open on Adrian's desktop monitor. Naomi hesitated. Adrian never shared passwords with her anymore, but he had once used the same code for everything back when life was simpler. Naomi slowly typed the date of their old apartment building address. The computer unlocked immediately. For a moment, Naomi almost laughed. The man had forgotten his marriage, but still used the same password from their poverty years. Some people carry guilt in strange ways. Naomi clicked through financial spreadsheets and executive emails carefully. Numbers filled the screen. Offshore accounts, investor payouts, settlement agreements, deleted patient complaints. Then she found a hidden folder labeled Recanola Lapel Risks Keys. Her stomach dropped instantly. Inside were confidential reports documenting patients who died after delayed transfers between hospitals during previous financial restructuring periods. This had happened before, more than once. Naomi covered her mouth slowly. Adrian knew people had died because of these decisions, and he kept doing it anyway. At that exact moment, her phone vibrated violently in her pocket, making her nearly jump from the chair. It was a message from another hospital worker she knew downstairs in emergency intake. "Naomi, that little girl from last night never made it." Naomi stared at the text message without blinking. Her vision blurred instantly. Kiara Matthews, 7 years old, dead. Snowstorm transfer complication. Outside the penthouse windows, Chicago traffic continued moving through dirty snow like nothing had happened. Rich people still walked into luxury coffee shops. Investors still scheduled meetings. News anchors still smiled on television. But somewhere in a morgue drawer, because powerful men wanted cleaner hallways. Naomi lowered her head into her hands. For the first time in years, she finally cried. Not loud. Not dramatic. just silent tears falling onto Adrian's expensive office desk. Because deep down, Naomi understood something horrifying now. Her husband was no longer simply a man corrupted by money. Adrian Cole had become dangerous. If this story has you holding your breath right now, subscribe and stay with us until the end, because Naomi is about to discover that the hospital scandal goes far deeper than even she realizes. And the truth hiding inside Hartwell Memorial is powerful enough to destroy empires. Naomi slowly wiped her tears away. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the tiny overnight recording device from her janitor cart. The small red light was still blinking softly. Recording, collecting evidence, waiting. And for the first time since marrying Adrian Cole, Naomi stopped thinking like a wife and started thinking like a witness. The storm swallowed Chicago completely by sunrise. Snow-buried sidewalks, traffic lights, and abandoned cars across the city. Ambulance sirens screamed endlessly through the white darkness while exhausted nurses inside Hartwell Memorial moved like ghosts between overcrowded hallways. Naomi arrived at work early that morning wearing the same clothes from yesterday. She had barely slept. The text message about the little girl replayed inside her mind all night long. She never made it. 4 words. That was all it took to destroy whatever hope Naomi still had left inside her marriage. Death always sounds colder when it's written in a text message. As Naomi entered the emergency department, the atmosphere felt different immediately. Too quiet. Staff members avoided eye contact. A young nurse near the reception desk looked like she had been crying for hours. Another doctor slammed paperwork onto a counter before walking away angrily. Nobody needed to explain what happened. The hospital itself already felt ashamed. Naomi slowly approached the intake desk. The little girl from Ward C. The nurse lowered her eyes instantly. Kiara Matthews? Naomi nodded weakly. The nurse swallowed hard before speaking. Ambulance got trapped near Lakeshore Drive during the storm. Her voice cracked slightly. The roads were completely blocked. Naomi felt her chest tighten painfully. How long? 43 minutes. 43 minutes. That little girl spent 43 minutes slowly dying inside a frozen ambulance while wealthy investors slept comfortably in luxury hotels downtown. Somewhere during those 43 minutes, Adrian Cole was probably discussing hospital expansion over expensive whiskey. Power rarely sees the bodies it steps over. Naomi asked quietly, "Where's her mother?" The nurse pointed toward a hallway near the family waiting rooms. Naomi walked slowly down the corridor until she saw her. Kiara's mother sat alone beside a vending machine, still wearing hospital socks and a thin gray hoodie. Her hands shook uncontrollably while she stared blankly at the floor. She looked young, too young to already carry this kind of grief. Naomi sat carefully beside her without speaking at first. The woman finally whispered, "They said she was stable enough to transfer." Naomi couldn't answer. "They promised me she'd be okay." Her voice broke completely then. "She was talking to me before they left." Naomi closed her eyes hard. Kiara probably believed adults were trying to save her. Children trust people so easily. That's what makes this world so cruel sometimes. Suddenly the grieving mother looked directly at Naomi. "You work here, right?" Naomi nodded slowly. The woman's eyes filled with tears. Did they really try? That question nearly shattered Naomi completely, because now she knew the truth. Kiara Matthews didn't die because of the storm alone. She died because rich men in expensive suits decided poor patients were bad for business optics. Naomi wanted to scream, wanted to tell this mother everything, wanted to drag Adrian downstairs and force him to look directly into the face of the life he destroyed. But grief trapped inside powerless people usually turns silent first. Naomi simply reached over and held the woman's trembling hand. Sometimes pain becomes too large for words anyway. A few hours later, Naomi found herself standing outside the hospital morgue. Her entire body felt numb. She didn't even remember walking downstairs. The morgue attendant opened the heavy metal door slowly after recognizing her hospital badge. Cold air rushed into the hallway immediately. Naomi stepped inside. Stainless steel drawers lined the walls beneath harsh fluorescent lights. The room smelled sterile, empty, dead. The morgue attendant spoke soft. "She's over Southern." Naomi walked forward mechanically until she reached the small covered body lying on the examination table. Tiny, too tiny. Someone had placed a pink stuffed rabbit beside Kiara's blanket before bringing her downstairs. Naomi stared at the child's small, covered form and suddenly remembered something Adrian once told her years ago while studying medicine. Every patient is somebody's whole world. Back then, he believed that. Or at least Naomi thought he did. She slowly reached toward the edge of the blanket covering Kiara's body. Her hands stopped shaking only because she had gone emotionally numb. Then Naomi completely broke apart. Tears exploded out of her so violently she nearly collapsed against the metal table. She covered her mouth to stop herself from screaming inside the morgue. Her shoulders shook uncontrollably while years of exhaustion, betrayal, poverty, humiliation, and grief finally crashed into her all at once. The little girl never even had a chance, and the man responsible slept every night in Naomi's bed. If your heart is hurting for Naomi right now, subscribe and stay with this story until the very end, because Kiara Matthews may be gone, but her death is about to expose something far darker hiding inside Hartwell Memorial Hospital. Naomi cried for several minutes before finally forcing herself to stand upright again. Her eyes slowly drifted toward the small pink rabbit beside Kiara's body. Then something inside her changed permanently. Until now, Naomi had still been afraid. Afraid of losing her marriage. Afraid of destroying Adrian's career. Afraid of what truth might cost. But standing inside that freezing morgue, none of those fears mattered anymore. Because once a child dies while powerful people protect profits instead of lives, silence becomes a form of guilt too. After Kiara Matthews died, Naomi stopped seeing Hartwell Memorial as a hospital. Every hallway looked different now. Every smiling executive, every polished donor event poster, every television commercial promising compassionate care. It all felt rotten underneath, like perfume sprayed over something already decaying. Hospitals are supposed to protect vulnerable people. But Hartwell had learned how to profit from them instead. 3 nights later, Naomi stayed past the end of her shift pretending to clean administrative offices on the 7th floor. Outside, the storm had finally passed, but dirty snow still covered Chicago like ash after a fire. Inside the hospital, things were strangely tense. Executives whispered in corners. Security presence had increased. Several staff members suddenly stopped discussing Kiara's death whenever Naomi walked nearby. Fear spreads quickly inside buildings full of secrets. Naomi pushed her cleaning cart slowly past the medical records department just after midnight when someone suddenly grabbed her wrist from the darkness. She nearly screamed. Quiet. It was Dr. Marcus Hill, one of the trauma surgeons from Ward C. His face looked exhausted, eyes bloodshot, tie crooked, like a man who hadn't slept properly in days. Naomi pulled her arm back carefully. "You scared me." Marcus glanced nervously down the hallway before speaking again. "I know about Adrian's meeting." Naomi froze instantly. Marcus lowered his voice. "I know you heard what happened." Naomi said nothing. Silence had become her survival instinct lately. Marcus swallowed hard. Kiara wasn't the first. Those words hit Naomi harder than she expected. Deep down, she already knew it. But hearing someone else confirm it made the horror real in a completely different way. Marcus glanced around again before quickly handing Naomi a small hospital access card. "Basement records room." Naomi stared at him. "Why are you giving me this?" Marcus laughed bitterly under his breath. "Because I became a doctor to save people." His jaw tightened. "Not to help rich men clean up dead bodies with paperwork." Then he walked away before Naomi could ask another question. Some people stay silent because they're evil. Others stay silent because they're terrified. Around 1:40 a.m., Naomi used the access card to enter the hospital's restricted basement archive level. The elevator doors opened into a dim corridor filled with old storage rooms, outdated computers, and filing cabinets stretching endlessly beneath fluorescent lights. The air smelled like dust and old paper. Almost nobody came down here anymore, which made it the perfect place to hide ugly truths. Naomi found the locked records office near the far end of the hallway. Her hands trembled slightly as she swiped the card. The door clicked open. Inside the room, rows of digital archive systems blinked quietly in the darkness. Naomi moved carefully between desks until she found one terminal still logged into the internal records database. Then she searched Kiara Matthews. File not. Naomi frowned immediately. She typed the patient ID number again carefully. Same result. Deleted. Her heartbeat quickened. Hospitals weren't supposed to erase emergency patient files, especially not after active transfer deaths. Naomi opened another database, then another. Soon she discovered something horrifying. Dozens of patient files connected to transfer complications had disappeared completely over the last 3 years. Many involved uninsured patients. Most came from black or low-income neighborhoods across Chicago. Some files contained partial deletion errors where fragments still remained visible. Delayed surgeries, insurance denial recommendations, administrative transfer prioritization, mortality exposure risks. Naomi covered her mouth slowly while staring at the screen. This wasn't random corruption anymore. This was a system, a machine feeding on poor people while pretending to heal them. The deeper she searched, the uglier everything became. Offshore financial accounts linked to hospital shell companies, secret payouts from pharmaceutical investors, internal emails discussing image-sensitive patients. One executive message made Naomi physically sick. Lower-income emergency cases negatively impact donor confidence during acquisition periods. Human lives had literally become financial liabilities inside executive spreadsheets. Wealthy people often use professional language to make cruelty sound intelligent. Then Naomi discovered a hidden folder buried inside archived financial projections. Project Clean Hallway. The same phrase she had seen inside Adrian's office. This version contained far more detail, color-coded appearance schedules, VIP donor routes, instructions for relocating uninsured patients before tours and fundraising events. One page included percentages estimating visual disruption risk caused by overcrowded emergency wards filled with low-income patients. Naomi stared at the screen in disbelief. Hartwell Memorial wasn't just hiding poor people. It was strategically removing them from sight so wealthy investors could feel comfortable spending money there. At that exact moment, Naomi heard footsteps approaching outside the archive room door. She instantly minimized the files and killed the monitor screen. Voices echoed through the hallway. 2 security guards. Adrian wants all archive transfer records reviewed by tomorrow morning. Naomi's chest tightened immediately. They knew, or at least Adrian suspected something dangerous existed in these files. Another guard spoke quietly. "You think this has anything to do with the little girl?" Silence, then the first guard answered coldly. "Our job isn't asking questions." Their footsteps faded slowly down the hallway. Naomi exhaled shakily for the first time in nearly a minute. Fear crawled through her entire body now, because she finally understood the full truth. This wasn't just about her marriage anymore. Hartwell Memorial had built an empire on the suffering of vulnerable people. And Adrian Cole wasn't simply protecting his career. He was protecting an entire machine worth billions. If this story has you completely hooked right now, subscribe and stay until the end. Because Naomi is getting dangerously close to exposing powerful people who would destroy anyone standing in their way. Naomi quickly grabbed a portable drive from the archive desk and began copying every file she could find. Deleted patient records, financial transfers, internal executive emails, offshore account data, evidence, real evidence. The tiny loading bar crawled painfully slow across the screen while Naomi kept glancing nervously at the door. Every second felt heavier than the last. Finally, the transfer completed. Naomi removed the drive carefully and slipped it deep inside her janitor cart beneath extra trash bags and chemical bottles, hidden where rich executives would never think to look. Because powerful people spend their whole lives ignoring workers like Naomi Brooks. And sometimes, that becomes the biggest mistake they ever make. Naomi carried the evidence for 6 days before finally deciding to release it. 6 long days of pretending nothing had changed while Adrian continued walking through Hartwell Memorial like a respected king. He still appeared on television talking about community health care, still smiled beside wealthy donors, still shook hands with politicians while nurses downstairs quietly whispered about Kiara Matthews dying in the storm. Every time Naomi looked at him now, she felt sick. The hardest part wasn't hatred. It was realizing she no longer recognized the man she once loved. By the 7th night, Chicago had almost moved on from the storm. News channels stopped covering the deaths. Roads reopened. Investors returned downtown. Rich people resumed expensive dinners while poor families buried loved ones quietly across the city. That's the problem with tragedy in America. If the victims are poor enough, the world moves on fast. Naomi sat alone inside her car outside an old 24-hour diner near West Madison Street just after midnight. Snow still covered the edges of the parking lot in dirty gray piles. Her hands rested tightly around the small flash drive containing everything. Deleted patient files, offshore transfers, internal emails, and the recording. Adrian's voice still haunted her every night. Then transfer her somewhere else. Naomi finally pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had saved earlier that week. Rachel Monroe, investigative journalist, known across Chicago for exposing political corruption and hospital fraud cases powerful people usually buried quickly. The line connected after 2 rings. "This is Rachel." Naomi looked through the windshield toward the empty street. "I have evidence people are dying inside Hartwell Memorial because executives care more about investors than patients." Silence, then Rachel spoke carefully. "Who is this?" Naomi hesitated only a second. "Someone who works there." The meeting happened the next evening inside a small church community office on the south side. Rachel Monroe arrived wearing jeans, boots, and a thick winter coat, with a camera bag hanging from one shoulder. She looked tired in the way serious journalists often do. Like someone who spent too many years looking directly at ugly truths. Naomi placed the flash drive slowly onto the table between them. Rachel frowned slightly. "What's on this?" Naomi's voice remained calm. "Enough to destroy Hartwell Memorial." Rachel studied her carefully before plugging the drive into her laptop. The room stayed completely silent while files loaded across the screen. Deleted patient reports. Financial corruption. Offshore accounts. Internal transfer directives. Then Rachel opened the audio recording from the storm night meeting. Adrian's voice filled the room clearly. "I don't want uninsured poor patients flooding the hallways when investors arrive." The young nurse's trembling voice followed. "A little girl could die." Then Adrian answered coldly. "Then transfer her somewhere else." Rachel slowly removed her hands from the keyboard. Her expression had completely changed now. Journalists hear lies every day. But every once in a while, they hear something evil enough to silence even themselves. "Jesus Christ," Rachel whispered. Naomi looked down at the table. "The little girl died during the transfer." Rachel stared at her for several seconds. "Do you understand what this is?" Naomi nodded weakly. "Yes." Rachel leaned back slowly. "This could become federal." Naomi's eyes filled slightly with emotion for the first time all night. "Good. Sometimes grief stops wanting apologies. Sometimes it only wants truth." 48 hours later, Chicago exploded. The story hit every major news station just after 6 a.m. Hartwell Memorial accused of prioritizing investors over patient lives. Leaked recordings flooded television broadcasts and social media feeds across the city. Adrian's voice echoed everywhere. "Then transfer her somewhere else." Protesters gathered outside Hartwell Memorial before noon carrying signs covered in snow and anger. "Justice for Kiara. Poor people deserve care too." "Blood is not a business mortal," nurses cried during live interviews outside the emergency entrance. Families demanded investigations into previous patient deaths. Former hospital employees suddenly began coming forward anonymously online describing years of corruption and cover-ups inside Hartwell. Once fear cracks open publicly, truth spreads fast. Inside the hospital, chaos erupted. Investors began pulling funding. Emergency board meetings locked down executive floors. Security rushed through hallways confiscating devices and reviewing internal communications. Adrian Cole disappeared from public view entirely by midday. But around 3 p.m., something happened that sent an entirely different wave of panic through the building. Black SUVs arrived outside the hospital entrance. Then more. Federal agents stepped out wearing dark jackets marked FBI. Staff members stopped moving. Nurses whispered nervously across hallways. One executive nearly dropped his coffee watching agents walk through the lobby toward administrative elevators. Hartwell Memorial suddenly looked less like a hospital and more like a crime scene. Power looks invincible right until the moment law enforcement walks through the front door. Naomi stood silently near the employee corridor watching everything unfold from a distance. Nobody around her knew she was the reason the entire empire was collapsing in real time. Rachel Monroe's live report played across televisions mounted throughout the hospital lobby. Federal investigators are now examining allegations involving patient transfers, insurance fraud, executive misconduct, and possible criminal negligence connected to multiple deaths. Naomi stared at the screen while people rushed around her in panic. 6 days ago, she was just a tired janitor everyone ignored. Now billion-dollar executives were terrified because one invisible woman finally decided to speak. If you're still here with this story, subscribe now and stay until the very end. Because Adrian Cole is about to discover that losing money is nothing compared to losing the image he spent his entire life building. Then Naomi's phone vibrated softly in her pocket. A private message from Adrian. 3 words. "Did you do this?" Naomi stared at the screen for several long seconds, then slowly locked the phone without answering. Because for the first time in years, Adrian Cole no longer frightened her at all. 3 weeks after the scandal broke, Adrian Cole barely recognized his own life anymore. The penthouse overlooking downtown Chicago still looked luxurious from the outside. Marble floors, private elevator, floor-to-ceiling windows glowing above the city skyline. But inside, the place felt hollow now. Quiet in the worst possible way. No music, no conversation, no warmth. Just silence echoing through expensive rooms that suddenly felt too large for one man. Wealth feels impressive until there's nobody left to share it with. Adrian sat alone in the living room, staring at muted news coverage playing across the television. Every channel still carried updates about Hartwell Memorial, lawsuits, federal investigations, families demanding justice, former employees exposing years of corruption inside the hospital system. And every few hours, the same leaked recording played again. Then transfer her somewhere else. Adrian had stopped sleeping properly days ago. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes now. His beard had grown uneven. Half-empty whiskey bottles lined the kitchen counter beside untouched takeout containers. The luxury penthouse no longer looked like success. It looked like a man slowly collapsing in private. That morning, Adrian's attorney called just after 8 a.m. The board scheduled an emergency vote. Adrian rubbed his forehead tiredly. About what? Silence, then the lawyer answered carefully. Your removal. Adrian closed his eyes slowly. Even after everything, hearing the words out loud still hit differently. They can't do that? Adrian, I built that hospital. His voice cracked sharply for the first time in weeks. I built everything. The lawyer sighed quietly through the phone. Right now they're trying to save the company from collapsing. Adrian laughed bitterly. Save the company. Funny how quickly powerful people abandon you once protecting you becomes expensive. 2 hours later, Adrian entered Hartwell Memorial through a private underground entrance to avoid reporters waiting outside the building. Security guards who once greeted him confidently now avoided eye contact completely. Employees lowered their voices when he passed through the hallways. Some stared openly with anger, others with disappointment. Adrian suddenly understood something painful. Fear looks very similar to respect until power disappears. Inside the executive boardroom, 12 directors sat around the long glass table waiting silently. Expensive suits, stiff expressions, legal folders stacked neatly in front of them. The same people who once applauded Adrian during investor meetings now looked at him like a contagious disease. Board Chairman Leonard Graves spoke first. Federal investigators continue expanding their inquiry. Adrian remained standing. I already told you the recordings were taken out of context. Nobody answered. Another board member slid several printed financial reports across the table. We also discovered undisclosed offshore accounts connected to executive hospital funds. Adrian's jaw tightened immediately. Naomi, it had to be Naomi. The realization burned through him instantly. She had exposed everything, not just the recordings, everything. Leonard folded his hands together carefully. Public trust in Hartwell Memorial has collapsed. Adrian stared around the room slowly. So that's it? Silence again. Then Leonard finally spoke the words Adrian feared most. The board has voted unanimously to terminate your position as CEO effective immediately. Adrian stood completely still. 8 years building Hartwell into one of Chicago's most profitable hospital systems, gone in one sentence. That's the thing about power. People spend their whole lives chasing it, only to discover how quickly it disappears once the truth arrives. Adrian laughed softly under his breath, not because anything felt funny, because he genuinely didn't know what else to do anymore. You all knew what was happening, he muttered quietly. Several board members looked away immediately. Adrian shook his head slowly. Every single one of you. Leonard's voice hardened slightly. This meeting is over, just like that. No applause. No farewell speech, no gratitude. The same hospital empire Adrian sacrificed his humanity to build had now thrown him away to protect itself. Outside the boardroom windows, reporters crowded behind police barriers in the snow waiting for statements. News helicopters circled above downtown Chicago. Protesters still gathered near the emergency entrance carrying photographs of lost family members. Adrian walked through the hallway alone toward the elevators while hospital employees watched silently from a distance. Nobody stopped him, nobody defended him, nobody cared anymore. Because once powerful men fall publicly, the world suddenly remembers every person they stepped on climbing upward. If you've stayed with this story until now, subscribe and stay for the final chapter, because Naomi Brooks is about to face Adrian one last time, and what she says to him will leave scars deeper than any prison sentence ever could. Later that night, Adrian returned to the empty penthouse carrying a cardboard box filled with office belongings, awards, framed photographs, business cards, meaningless things. He set the box down near the kitchen counter and finally noticed something sitting there beside the sink. Naomi's old bus pass from years ago. Worn edges, cracked plastic. The same bus pass she used after selling her car so Adrian could afford medical exams. Adrian picked it up slowly with trembling hands, and for the first time since the scandal began, he finally cried, not for losing Hartwell, not for losing money, but because deep down, Adrian Cole finally understood the truth. He lost Naomi long before the FBI ever arrived. Naomi took a slow breath. She no longer looked down at her notes. This time she looked directly at the families sitting in front of her. "I want everyone to understand something," she said softly. "This story is not only about a corrupt hospital, and it's not only about a man betraying his wife." The room fell silent. This story is about the moment human beings begin believing that some lives are worth more than others. Naomi tightened her hands slightly against the podium. When wealthy people suffer, the system calls it an emergency. When poor people suffer, they're told to wait. When rich families lose someone, the entire world sends flowers and condolences. But when poor mothers lose their children, they're handed paperwork and cold apologies. Kiara's mother lowered her head, clutching the small pink rabbit tightly against her chest. Naomi continued, her voice trembling but steady. "That is the ugliest part of all this. Not because poor people need pity, but because poor people are human beings too. They have mothers, children, unfinished dreams, dinners they never got to eat together, promises they never got the chance to keep." Several people inside the room quietly wiped away tears. A poor child should never die because they were born in the wrong neighborhood. A poor mother should never have to beg for her child to receive treatment. And a janitor should never be treated like she's invisible, simply because her job is cleaning up the messes powerful people leave behind. Naomi paused for a moment. "And I learned something painful through all of this too." She swallowed hard. "I used to believe loving someone meant standing beside them no matter how much they changed. I thought if I stayed patient long enough, sacrificed deeply enough, stayed quiet enough, eventually they would remember who they used to be." She looked toward the grieving families sitting in the front rows. But love does not mean standing beside what is wrong. Loyalty does not mean protecting evil, and sacrifice does not mean allowing someone to destroy your dignity. The entire room beat still. Naomi spoke more slowly now. "There are people who know how to pray when they are poor, but forget gratitude once they become rich. There are people who speak beautifully about kindness while they struggle, but begin treating kindness like weakness the moment they gain power." She looked directly into the cameras. Adrian did not lose his humanity overnight. He lost it piece by piece. Every time he became ashamed of where he came from. Every time he stayed silent while people looked down on me. Every time he chose profits over patience. And every time I stayed quiet just to keep peace, I was slowly abandoning myself too. That sentence broke something inside the room. Naomi placed one hand gently against her chest. "I'm not saying this to blame people who stay silent. I understand that silence. Sometimes we stay quiet because we're afraid of losing our family, afraid of losing our job, afraid nobody will believe us, afraid of starting over." Her eyes filled with tears, but when our silence allows innocent people to keep getting hurt, silence stops being peace, it becomes chains. She turned toward Kiara's mother. "I was too late to save Kiara." Her voice cracked completely, but I refused to let my silence help bury another child. Soft crying spread throughout the audience. Naomi wiped her tears slowly before continuing. "The biggest lesson I learned from all of this is that character is not measured by titles. A CEO is not more valuable than a janitor. A man in an expensive suit is not cleaner than the woman scrubbing blood from hospital floors at 3 a.m. Her voice grew firmer. The true value of a human being is revealed by how they treat people who cannot benefit them. Silence. Adrian had money, power, his name on buildings. But when he stood in front of a poor little girl who needed help, he chose to protect his image instead. Naomi slowly shook her head. That means he was spiritually poorer than anyone inside Ward C. The room fell completely still. But the nurses who cried in those hallways, the janitors who kept working through the night, the doctors who risked their careers to tell the truth, those people still possessed something priceless. She said the final word carefully. Conscience. Naomi looked directly into the cameras one last time. So, if you are listening to this story today, please remember this. Never allow money to make you look down on another person's pain. Never allow success to make you ashamed of where you came from. And never love someone so deeply that you lose your own voice trying to protect them. She took one final breath. Character is the only wealth that truly matters. Once you lose it, it doesn't matter how luxurious your penthouse is, how expensive your car becomes, or how powerful your title sounds. Her eyes hardened quietly. Inside, you are still bankrupt. This time, the applause began slowly, then grew louder. Not because Naomi had won, but because someone had finally spoken out loud the pain so many people had spent years swallowing in silence. Later that evening, Naomi stood alone outside the community center, watching snow fall gently across Chicago. She was no longer the woman desperately trying to save a broken marriage. And she was no longer the janitor who believed she had to bow her head around powerful people. She was simply Naomi Brooks, a woman who had been hurt, been afraid, been silent, but finally chose truth anyway. And sometimes, that is the highest form of courage a person can have. This is a fictional story created for inspirational and educational purposes about life values. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental.